Hey guys, I'm so glad you could join us for another Enneagram episode. We have so much fun today talking about marriage, relationships, and all things nature today because we have a very fun guest, Stephanie Spencer. Enneagram 4 is going to come on and share with us about her new book project, Out of the Box and Into the Wild, an Enneagram study on nature and the triads. So you are going to get to feast on, if you see this on YouTube or decide to get her book, you're going to get to feast on the imagery of her beautiful travels and the extrapolation she can make from those travels to us as to metaphorical understanding of the Enneagram instead of the understanding of just like putting ourselves into that box like you're a type 1, you're a type 2, you're a perfectionist, you're a performer. She expands us a bit. She allows us to play. And I think that's what this whole month of podcasts has been about, is adventuring together. And she does that through beauty. I love her fourness that she brings into this process with us to just tell us, even in the backstory, that she came to this book and all of the beautiful nature viewing that she does through wonder and through really sitting with the textures and the sensations of each place and each metaphor she chooses to use for each type. So I hope these metaphors really bless you in your relationship so that instead of just coming at your partner, you can be a bit more out of the box and say like, ooh, I noticed we have these through lines together. Or I could be a bit like a bear at times. You could be a bit like an octopus. And we'll talk these analogies out, but she's got so many more and also very rich earthy metaphors and metaphors from biology that we can just, instead of always using the type language, really allow ourselves to expand even in how we think of our families and ourselves. So I'm excited for this episode. And I know when I was doing family therapy work and clinical studies, a lot of times you do, even today with clients, use a family metaphor. And some people will say, oh, we're like a boat because we really float well and we have fun. And especially teen clients, they can enjoy those kinds of metaphors. Or they might be like, and here's who's at the front of that boat. Or, if we use the analogy of an animal, we can really allow ourselves to say like, but I get very self-protective when I go hibernate. So you can see that instead of just polarizing, we're bringing in a new language. And I think that is so cool because in marriage, we need creativity and healthy metaphors and language because it can get really heated, right? I just came off a traveling trip with people for like 7 or 8 days together. And you're like, oh, I need a little bit of space, or I need a little bit of a new way to talk about how I'm feeling that isn't going to hurt anybody's feelings. And so it's beautiful to have Stephanie to share with us and to guide us through ways to say, here's a strength of yours, here's a strength of mine. And let's also remember the beauty and the glory of letting stress off in marriage, in fun, in summer, in relationships when we need to most. So maybe you're not listening to this episode or watching it in the summer, but either way, make sure you're starting to also, as you listen to this convo, just join us for thoughts about getting your own travels going, even if it's very small places locally. Like I live in the Tampa, St. Pete area of Florida. Like, okay, I could go to the Florida Scrub or the ocean and enjoy a preserve and go kayaking. And these are things I can do right here. Or we could be talking about Stephanie's great trips where she's thinking about, she's, I think, headed on to Sequoia Arches. She's going to Zion. She's going to be all over doing this beautiful exploration. And then she'll go home to her northern city. So it's important that you look with us at both these wonderful epic journeys you can take, as well as just the journeys that are everyday, right? So I know I grew up in Michigan. We were always hiking and on nature walks constantly at the metro parks. And wherever you're at, just enjoy that space outdoors in the wild. Get yourself out of the box, out of the number for a little bit, and just join us on this journey with Stephanie so that we can deep dive together into what I hope is a beautiful way for you to learn. Stephanie, thank you so much for joining us on the Enneagram and Marriage podcast. I'm so excited for this.
You're welcome. I'm happy to be here.
Well, we were just talking before we got on about recent adventures, and this whole month on the podcast, we've been doing the very same. So thank you for sharing adventures with us. So excited to talk about you, your adventures, your book today. Tell us a little bit about yourself.
So I live in Minnesota. I am from Wisconsin originally, which is actually a surprisingly different culture than Minnesota.
Mm,
Um,
interesting.
and My husband and I met there actually when we were in college. We both went to UW-Madison and stayed there a while before coming back to Minnesota, where he's from.
Mm.
I used to be a pastor, and now I am an Enneagram coach and I co-lead a nonprofit here in the Twin Cities, and I have two teenage boys.
Oh, how cool and interesting and diverse. And now you have to tell us what are the differences between Minnesota and Wisconsin, if there are. Yeah, this is so interesting.
Well, I think the way I would summarize it is about how immigration affects the culture of a place in the long term.
Mhm.
So, more German immigrants settled in Wisconsin, more Scandinavian immigrants settled in Minnesota. And there's a big difference between German and Scandinavian culture, which
Oh.
creates a big difference between Wisconsin and Minneapolis or Minnesota culture.
Absolutely, it does. And some of my friends from, and of course, Enneagram lingo as your listeners. One of my best friends down here is from Minnesota, such a nine, just like so sweet. Like now you're helping me to understand the Scandinavian culture probably a bit more.
Well, there's a phrase called Minnesota nice,
Oh,
which is really actually means Minnesota passive aggressive, which
yeah.
could also
The
describe type
9.
9
Yes.
potentially.
True, true, and we've talked at that length of that too, because we used to co-teach together, and when people would make her mad, I was like, "Okay, I'm watching this how it plays out," but, like,
Right.
so amazing, so sweet. Anna, if you're listening, I adore you. But I love hearing that there's this difference and that you got to be part of both. How cool is that?
Mhm. Yeah, and we've lived here now in Minnesota for 10, 11 years.
Mm.
And so we're pretty embedded here. And my husband grew up here. I grew up in Wisconsin.
Okay. And is there more of a 1 or a 6 overlay in Wisconsin? Do you see any kind of Enneagram tendencies there?
Yeah, I would say it probably depends what part you're in.
Yeah.
We lived in Madison after we got married, which is its own
Okay.
progressive, interesting little bubble as
Yeah, yeah.
compared to the rest of the state. I grew up in a smaller town that I would say is more six-ish in its culture. Yeah.
Aw, well, very diverse, and you bring
Mhm.
to us this beautiful diversity in all you do. Tell me a little bit about you said you have your 2 boys, and how old are
Mhm.
they?
16 and 13.
Do they know their Enneagram types, or do you kind of hold off on that?
Yeah, I really a little bit. So I want them to take the lead on that. And so when they're interested, we talk about it. When they're not interested, we don't talk about it. And I want to help them type themselves more than have them feel typed by me. So I have some guesses.
Ooh, I
They
love
have some guesses, but we haven't officially done that together.
Yeah, and we're gonna go over some triad work today too, and that might even be what some parents do where they're like, "Okay, I know you're a heart type, I know you're a thinking type, I know you're a body type."
Hmm.
So that's fun to be able to hold it loosely for those
Yes.
ages.
Hmm. Yeah, I
Um,
find that too.
yes, and tell me a little bit about how you met your spouse or, just family stuff too.
Yeah, we both went to the same college, and so
Yeah, that's right.
we met there, and so we got married pretty young actually. So I was 21 and he was 23 when we got married,
Yeah.
and we'll be married this summer. We'll be married for 23 years. We got married in 2000, which is nice. Like that's an easy. We
Yeah.
always know what anniversary we're
Yeah,
on,
that's true.
so
Oh my
it's really
gosh.
helpful.
Jealous. Yeah.
um I think it's been interesting using Enneagram now as a tool for marriage. We didn't have that in the beginning of our marriage, but I am a 4 and
Yeah.
he is a 1. And that has become a really helpful way to understand our similarities and our differences as we have found that language for it. And I find him to be a really important grounding presence in my life. And we have in
Mhm.
common that sort of partnership with a 1, it sounds like,
Yeah, yeah,
and being across that arrow line,
yeah.
and what it is to have the grounding force across that arrow line with another type. So
Yeah.
it took me a while to land on type 4 for myself, actually, because I'm a self-preservation type. And
Oh,
so
yeah. Mhm.
it sort of
Accountable.
hides itself. Um,
Yeah.
but
Mhm.
and I think in marriage that becomes an interesting thing because I I can sometimes stay a little quiet about what I need and want because
Mhm.
there's a thing in me that feels like I should always be suffering.
Mhm.
And I don't know if fours are sometimes portrayed as types that are loud about their needs. And I think self preservation types are actually more likely to be quiet
Mhm.
about their needs because
Yeah.
of the way that we can reinforce patterns of suffering through not
Mhm.
asking for what we need. So that's
Yeah.
something I've been working on
Great.
in recent years in marriage is doing that
Mm. Which is so good for your marriage because with a one, they can just, as we know, in that way, just kind of plug forward and do. And if you don't say, this is really spelled out here, although they have a four as well, and sometimes ones can actually dig and see it. I
more.
often notice that, yes, my husband can do that at times, but a lot of times, as you said, that self press four piece can hide, and so they
Mhm.
have no idea, they're just in the doing space, and so you've had
Right.
to really be brave and bold and take some risks, I bet.
Mhm. And it was interesting, actually, I remember this conversation happened, like, a year ago when we were hiking, together on a trip to Colorado
Mhm.
that, I said, "When you ask me for things, do you expect that I say no if I can't do them?" He
Mm.
said, "Of course." And
Yeah,
I realized that what had happened is the sort of as that gut type,
yeah,
he will always try to get what he can get. So he'll always ask for me to do like if he wants me to make dinner, he'll ask me to make dinner. And he's
yeah.
expecting that if I can't make dinner, I'll say no. And so I
Mm,
was in this place where I had been thinking of him as being demanding, but it
mm,
was really because I wasn't being boundaried.
mm,
And so just kind of working that out and saying like, oh, he's
mhm.
actually just asking. He's
Mm,
not demanding.
yeah.
And what is it to speak up when I can or can't do something and realize that's actually my issue and not his when it's happening.
Mm. Mhm. Yeah, I've definitely projected a lot in that way as well, and I think that sometimes when you do have and you also have, like you said, a one arrow, when you
Mhm.
have that, your own self-critic can come in and say, like, "That person in the body space, a 1, 8, or 9, they're judging me, they're critiquing me," and you're like, "I'm telling a story that isn't true."
Right. Right. I love that Brene Brown language of the story I'm telling myself is because it's
Exactly.
often not actually the story.
Yeah, yeah, it's true. And then there's that victim space in the 4. So we could really go all day. And I loved this. Actually, she's a 1-4 combo. Also, Elizabeth Bennett came on earlier last year on the podcast, and she's like, something that's been helpful for the 4 space is to remember that we can always come back to it if we need it, but we need to get
Mm.
up and do. And I remember that, and it helps me sometimes when I'm stuck
Yeah.
there.
And I think actually that's where I really see sometimes I don't fit some of the descriptions of a four. I think because I've been married to a one for so long. And so
Oh,
there's a lot of that energy that's pulled me forward as we've been together and partnered because he's such a doer and I'll go with him on the doing and it'll pull me out of stuckness in a really helpful way.
yeah, that's beautiful. I love that glow between the 1 and 4 in that way. You guys are such a beautiful combo. You do shine so brightly. And like you said, you're doing inhibited, he's doing dominant in that way because ones are doers.
Mhm.
So I'm grateful. And now you get to share with us out of that beautiful bright light you bring together some of your adventures. So it's all coming together with me realizing you're a 4 as to the way you've been able to captivate us with the beauty of the text. So
Mm.
I hope our listeners who are actually viewing on YouTube might be able to get a sneak peek of your book in a few minutes. Um, but yay.
Sure.
But
Yeah.
I also, before that, tell us a little bit about like why it's helpful for couples to adventure in your view.
Yeah, that's something that we have always had between us is traveling together. And for us, we find that that has been more important than having dates. So
Mm,
when either of us have a date away, like when, especially I'm thinking about when the kids were young, it just
yeah.
wasn't quite enough time
Mm,
to really find presence with each other
mm,
just for a night. And so there's value in that. But what we really found is we were lucky enough to have grandparents who could help to get away
mm,
for weekends or even weeks a week or so once a year by just the two of us to have that space and time of travel and getting away, being in nature, and that there's
mm,
when we do something like that, that's really grounding for the two of us. And then as the kids have gotten older, we've also then had adventures together, the four of us, which has been really beautiful. So we love traveling internationally. My husband speaks Spanish, so that's really helped us travel to Spanish speaking places. We love camping. And we just went hiking on Sunday on Father's Day, and um,
oh,
we were talking about how like there's just a space for conversation differently hiking between the two of us and when the kids are with us, where you're just not distracted, you're side by side. There's a way that it's just a different sort of space than
Mhm.
sitting at a table or sitting at home,
Yeah.
to hike together. And so we love traveling out west to national parks. So we did a national park road trip. Every couple of years we do one of them. So we did a Yellowstone road trip one year. A couple years
Ooh.
ago we did Glacier and Tetons, and this year we're actually doing Yosemite and
Mm.
um, Zion and a bunch of those Western ones. So we're really looking forward to that in July.
Oh my gosh, I'm so happy for you and just knowing you're gonna capture it, and I know both as a 1 and a 4, you guys are just gonna sit in it and revel in that beauty, aren't you?
Yeah, well, maybe not so much sitting. There's a lot of hiking. There's a lot of
Yeah.
movement.
Yeah,
Capturing it
that's
with
true.
movement.
You were saying that. He's got you going as a 1 and
Right.
you're in your space of happy joy,
Yeah, and I
with
bring my
him there.
camera along and
Oh,
I'll pause to take pictures and we'll figure that out. And we actually got a permit this summer to hike both Half Dome and Angel's Landing, both of which are lotteries, and we won both lotteries. And I'm terrified and excited that we're gonna
yeah.
do these
Oh
dangerous,
my
wonderful hikes.
gosh, that's amazing. My friend
Mhm.
got engaged on Half Dome, and it is apparently, like you're saying, from what I saw in Yosemite last year, it looks pretty intense, so I'm really excited for you.
Yeah, it's like a 17-mile hike with a lot of elevation gain and these like chains at the end that you
Yeah,
have to hold
I
on to
saw
get up.
that.
And so
Whoa.
I'm a little bit scared of heights. So we'll see how it
Yeah.
goes.
Just don't look down. You'll be
Right.
fine. That's what I've noticed when they're scarier. I'm like, "Don't look down, just enjoy the
Yes.
beautiful view and the beautiful sky."
Well, and one of the things I've realized, like when we camp together as a family, what I love as a self-preservation type, my partner's a social type,
Mhm.
and so as a self-preservation type, sometimes my anxiety is higher than it needs to be about things like hikes, especially with the kids. And so I've actually used him as my adventure radar. Like
Mm.
when we're together as a family and the kids will say like, "Can I climb that rock?" I have an instinct that says no. But
Yeah.
that's one of the times I'll look to him and say, "What do you think?" Because you have this sort of orientation to what's right that is
Yeah.
usually right, annoyingly so. Um,
Yeah.
and this sort of gut strength that says, "No, they can handle that." And so I'm sort of relying on that this summer too, that as we do these more dangerous things, there's a way I can be like, "All right, are we
Oh.
okay? Okay, we look like okay. I'm gonna trust that we're okay."
Oh, I love that. I love that you can capitalize with your husband's strength here and also you know you'll get that full saturation of enjoyment and less regret when you do that. When you kind of press on towards something different and you come into that balance of your instinct. That's a
Mhm.
beautiful reminder for our listeners who might also tend towards too much social, too much self-pres, too much one-to-one. There's that beautiful striking of balance when you marry and then you're also telling us that the shadow for you guys of the one to one, which is ours as well, it is nurtured by you traveling together even more than date
Yes.
nights. So that's
Mhm.
important for people to listen who are like, we're not super date nighty. Like you don't have to be, but just make sure you're continuing on adventures. And I love how you say this is an important space because we can be in nature together. And I love how you're challenging yourself with hikes, but I also love to remind families with younger children like, there's easy hikes for them to do too, lots of those
Yes.
probably along the way through many years of marriage.
Mhm. Yeah, it hasn't always been big ones or hard ones. Sometimes it's even just going, down to a river and hanging out. Or we have a waterfall here in the Twin Cities called Minnehaha Falls. That's just really easy to get to, and you can do a short little hike, and it's a
Oh,
lovely chance to be out.
that's beautiful. Tell us your trajectory of your trip because you were telling me, and it's so fun to hear other people so that you can maybe plan that one too.
Yeah, well, I think what we landed on that was an unexpected help is that I'm going out to the International Enneagram Association conference in San Francisco in July. And we decided that that actually could be the starting point of the trip. So the whole family is flying out, but then we are renting a car one way, which really helps from Minnesota to
Mm.
get to those Western national parks because the loop of that drive is so long. So we'll be able to
Mm.
start in California and drive back to Minnesota, and in doing that, we'll have more time at each place than if we had to do the whole loop. So we're spending some time in Yosemite and then Sequoia, Kings Canyon, and then Zion and Bryce, and then Arches and Canyonlands, and then going. So both those are in Utah, and then we'll go into Colorado and do some Mesa Verde and some great sand dunes, and then we'll drive back because honestly, from Colorado to Minnesota, there's not much
Okay.
exciting. Sorry, anyone who lives
Yeah.
in Nebraska and goes in between, but we'll just try to drive that fast.
Right, because they do other things. They go to coffee shops, they do
Right.
their marathon runs. I don't know what they do, but I know that you guys do beautiful things because I am here in flat Florida, so I understand. We still have a good life.
Yes.
Um, but but I'm happy that you have these moments and there's so much beauty on your, horizon. I'm so grateful. And we were able to talk last week when I was in all those different spaces, and not all of them, but a few of them. So I'm grateful that we can learn from you because you have a richness and a depth that I think, as I mentioned, fours really bring to us in terms of kind of grabbing, not just going, but you
Mhm.
really sit in and let the beauty saturate you. And you've brought that to your book. So, can you tell us about your Enneagram book? I think it's very unique, and I haven't seen one like it.
Yeah, it's who had mentioned a sneak peek.
Yeah.
So this is actually a proof copy I have next to me. So it's got the little line on it. The real
Mhm.
copy doesn't have the little line on it. But
Yeah.
it's called Out of the Box and Into the Wild, an Enneagram journey through the triads of nature.
Mm.
And there's two things that I really was wanting to do with this book. One is about triads and one is about nature. So I think that there's a little less out there on the triads. And I have found that to be a really helpful piece of Enneagram, especially as I do work with teams.
Mhm.
I've ended up finding myself a lot in the corporate world in the Enneagram work that I do. And one of the things that triads offer is a way that every type has something in common with every other type. And so
Mm.
sometimes in our type descriptions, we just feel really separate from each other. Like I'm this way and you're that way, but everybody has a triad in common with every other type. And so like
Mm.
for me with my one partner, we're together in the idealist triad. And
Mhm.
I see that in the way that we operate and like we do house projects a lot because both
Yeah.
of us can capture onto that vision and find the energy of that vision of the idealism triad. And it's meaningful that we have that in common. What
Mm.
we have different is we have our harmonic groups, which is our conflict styles. That's different. I'm reactive and he's competent in his conflict style, and that triad. It's also helpful to know we don't have that in common.
Yeah.
And to have the language for the difference in that triadic approach for me needing to process things and him
Yeah.
wanting to solve things and saying, oh,
Yeah.
just time out. That's a different need. How do we make space for each other in those triad groups? So in the book, then there's imagery for all these different triad groups. So most people are the most familiar with the triad of the head, heart, and gut centers. So that's here. So
Mm.
I have with the gut center, so types 8, 9, and 1, I use the imagery of earth. With the
Mhm.
heart center, types 2, 3, and 4, I use the imagery of water. And with the head center, 5, 6, and 7, I use the imagery of air. Um, and then each type within that has different symbols. So like as a 4, I've got an iceberg as the version of
Mm.
water that is me. Um, and then there's a description of that sort of scientifically to help people enter into that imagery of the metaphor and sit with it. As you said, I love the way you said that about the invitation, an invitation to just sit with this a little bit. Then a
Yeah.
description of the type itself, kind of making that connection. And then there's always reflection questions for every page because I'm always asking questions. I'm always
Yeah.
asking people to sit with deeper questions.
Mm.
Um, but
Wow.
then that's only one of the triads. So another triad group is about how we hold our energy. So
Mhm.
here I have the active and receptive and balancing energy. Sometimes that's also social styles is another way it's called, or so it's assertive or withdrawing or compliant social styles.
Yeah.
So here I have then the assertive I have as tropical temperature, and the receptive I have as boreal temperature, and the balancing I have as temperate. And that matters for how we're approaching things socially, and to sit with that metaphor for a little bit for kind of our temperature as we're entering a room.
Mm.
And then for our conflict styles, I went with animals because as a reactive type, I think I can own that I'm more like a carnivore.
Yeah.
So that's types 4, 6, and 8.
Yeah.
The positivity type. So this would be you as the 7, the sevens, the nines, the twos who are putting the spin on it. That's more like herbivore. That's rolling with it a little differently. And I think omnivores are probably the most like that competency triad of 1, 3, and 5, who's really trying to solve problems and fix things,
Yeah.
and using that intellect to do so, like omnivores use their intellect to eat. And
Oh,
then the last triad is
cool.
plants. And so we have here we have what's sometimes called the harmony triads. I call them
Mm.
the collaboration triads because I find that this is really about how we work together, what we offer to people as we work with them. And
Mm.
so we have types 2, 5, and 8 in this diplomatic triad that offers themselves. And so I have that as the spore
Mm.
bearing plants.
Mm.
Um, I have, in contrast to that, I have that idealist triad that's really offering a vision. And so there I have the flower bearing plants.
Um,
And then in the middle, I have that pragmatist triad that says, actually, I'll offer, instead of doing spores or flowers, let's do rhizomes. And
yeah.
so we have types 3, 6, and 9. I have as rhizome plants because they reproduce by cloning themselves,
Mm,
and they often then reproduce faster because of the way that they're doing that. So I have that as that metaphor for our last triad. So
wow.
um, and then each type has different things. So this kind of at the end of the book, every type would have a bunch of images for their type that they can sit with. So these are the pages for type 2 to sit
Mm,
with for how all that goes together.
mm,
So that's the book. I'm excited for the way, I think about in using this with other people, whether it's a team or a family or a couple, to again notice those points in common and to notice those points that are different. So to say, okay, I am more like water.
yeah.
My husband is more like earth.
Yeah.
I am more
Love
like
that.
a carnivore. My husband is more like an omnivore. To even have that imagery starts to feel a little bit different. It feels a little bit lighter than just
Mhm.
saying, I do it this way and you do it that way. And that feeling of right, wrong that can happen as compared to just difference.
I love that. You bring us right into the world, into visual imagery, which I think is the spectacular piece of fours, bringing us the visual, the touch, the ways you guys seem to engage with the world feels granular in the sense of how deep you get and how close you get. And I think that that's something that has caused most of us probably in the world to be able to do what you're saying we need to do, which is, of course, go to the emotional depths together, but yet in a way that feels like we're not stuck. And I do see you and your husband's journey in that because he kind of lifts you up out of that, gets you doing, and of course you pull him into the pieces of the work that need to be looked at and sat with. And like you said, you're both idealists, so doing that in a beautiful way is your gift together. So I think that's a gift to all of us. And I felt that when I was going through your book, because as you're naming a lot of information there, I want to invite readers who maybe aren't watching on YouTube because our new to YouTube channel is new, is that it's really beautiful to walk through her book visually. And I'm not a visual person even, but there
Mm.
was a sense of peace because it wasn't overwhelming with words. And I read fast and I read a lot of words a week. And so just being invited into the cool, beautiful imagery, um, along with a few pieces of work, text and then some questions. And there's questions in each chapter, right? Mm.
Yeah, really on each page, every single thing
Mm.
that has an image with it has questions with it. And that really, that heart to slow down
Yeah.
is really there because I get overwhelmed. There are so many good Enneagram resources out there, but I get a little overwhelmed. It's so much to take in. And I felt the need to slow down. And I thought I'm probably not the only one who needs to slow
Yes.
down and just sit with some of this stuff a little bit longer instead of just taking in more and more and more information.
Yeah. I mean, I certainly appreciate that as a thinking type and need that desperately. So I was just so touched by it. And I know some of our listeners will be too in that way, many of them, because you're inviting us on adventure, but also into a very serious journey of growth and depth. And I noticed for my husband being a one, when I was sharing some of it with him, he was really happy with it. And he was like, this is really speaking to me because it was succinct and yet goes deep. So that's
Mhm.
beautiful.
That is the value of editors and
Mm,
being
yeah.
edited, I think, or even for
Yeah.
me, actually, I think as a 4, it's interesting I had a framework that I decided to follow for the book that really kept me restrained in a helpful way, because I think 4s can want
Mm,
to go to the depth so much that it can
yeah.
get overwhelming to other people to keep going that
Yeah.
that far.
Mm,
And there was a way that like each image had one page of text and one image to go with it, and so that meant it had to stay within that page of text. And I
yeah.
think that was helpful, and also meant it pushed me to have to describe each type as much as I could with an even amount of words,
Mhm.
in order to be in that framework, because there's a temptation I would have to use lots of words for the 4 because we're so, whatever. But to say, no, actually, we can be described in the same amount of words as other types. We can do that discipline of sort of finding that succinctness. The other thing that happened is one of my proofreaders was a type 1, who helped me actually change some of the imagery to be more colorful,
Mm.
because I hadn't noticed that I had picked sort of a monochrome color palette for some of the images of a one. And it made me think about how important it is to connect with people of different types about how things are landing with them, because it's
Mm.
always different to speak towards another type that's not mine,
Yeah.
than to hear from the person of that type. How did this land with you? And
Mm.
then to be able to receive that and say, it's actually important for me
Yeah.
to receive that editing and say, this didn't land right. So
Yeah.
I'm gonna shift and I'm gonna help it land better.
Yeah, I think that's really cool that when you do a book of this magnitude, there's a lot of hands in it. And I think that then you get to produce something extra beautiful and meaningful because, as you know, you can do as much expansiveness work as you can, and there's still going to be limitations because you still carry the four most strongly. So I love how you're
Mhm,
saying there was other people giving me input. I took it. It was harder at times than others, but I took it, and the result is you're being humble to say it's beautiful, but, I give credit to, a lot of people in this journey, and I think that's something I've learned as a writer too, and I think that that's awesome because I think
mhm,
readers are even more excited. They're like, "Oh, you considered other types." I
mhm,
also like how you were alluding here to just the sense that when you are looking at your type and your spouse's type, it's less of a hero victim mentality,
mhm,
or hero villain rather, because I think we do get into that a lot in marriage, especially.
mhm.
So, tell us how our audience might be able to avoid some of that when they start to look at the triads, because that is so big in middle marriage to be like, ah,
Mhm.
I learned your type. You're so hard and difficult for me. I wish I had a different type. Help us to understand like how you can balance this out a bit with this book.
Yeah, so I think the triads, for me, it gives this space for everybody to have a place that belongs, that there's not a hero, there's not a villain, there's not a victim,
Mm,
like we're all,
yeah.
it's that place of belonging. And so it's always easiest to think about it then with my own partnership that people could apply to others. So to say, okay, what does it mean for someone to be a gut and for someone else to be a heart?
Yeah.
What's missing? What's strong there? One of the things that means for us is we often meet in the head.
Mm,
That one of the ways to think about the triad is it can sometimes be easiest to meet in the triad that's not our own, to find that compromise and
mm,
middle ground. And
mm.
so we actually are able to have some of the more seamless places in conversation are when we're in the head, because that's not either of our dominant. And then we can also push each other to be connected to the one, that the other one's not dominant in. So that I think really helps there. I think
Yeah, great.
for the when I think about, I already mentioned the sort of the harmonic triads or the conflict styles that happen there, and I think that that capacity to have language for conflict style really matters a lot. I
Mm,
saw this happen in a team, where I broke up the team into different groups. So one was in the competency group. Everybody went picked their group according to their type. So there was a competency group, there was a positivity group, and there was this reactive group. And the competency group, like you could have heard a pin drop when they realized that the reactivity group didn't want them to solve the problem. They wanted that to be heard.
mm,
And they were just, that was completely new to them, that somebody, because we assume that the other person wants the same thing we want in conflict. So having that language of that triad difference really matters, for to say like, okay, in what does it mean for you to be in that positivity and to be partnered with somebody who's in that competency, and how can that both help, and how can that sometimes create a miss? Same thing, sometimes for me it really helps that I'm partnered with someone who wants to solve the problem, so that I don't just
yeah,
talk about it without
yeah.
solving it. And
Yeah,
sometimes that really is hard because I want to be heard before we solve it. And so the triad just gives a different language. It's a little bit more, uh, I find that it's sometimes easier to find that language than to find that type language. That if it's a little quicker to be like, oh, I'm being reactive right now, or I need that reactive space,
yeah, I love that.
or versus kind of thinking about all those descriptors of a one.
Yeah,
And I think that I really see that as well in the that energy triad difference for like what it is to be, um, balancing versus receptive. I see that there's a different um, response to expectations and social norms, where that matters more to somebody in that balancing triad than it matters to me. And so what is it to see that as an okay difference, to see that as
Mm.
a way that we show up differently in the world and can balance each other in that, and can find our way in that different approach.
That's really neat that you're like, I'm willing to offer what I have, but I'm also willing to receive when I'm doing my triad work because I know
Mhm.
there's something that I'm missing, but there's a gift that I have. And that's really, I think, humbling and it brings in some compassion towards the different person. And it allows us to see our spouse as valued and gifted versus, like we said, villainous of
Mhm.
you don't get it. You're missing this piece. And instead you're like, oh, we're each missing a piece, but we each hold something beautiful. And I even love how you said we can meet in that third section sometimes of whatever
Mhm.
triad we're in. We can meet in that head, heart, or body, whichever one we're not. And if we're reactive and logical, we can meet in the positivity space. And if we're withdrawing and aggressive, we can meet in sort of a compliance space. Like that's neat for me to think on. And I think some of our listeners are probably piecing that together as well. And I like how you gave a particular also animal to each type too. So I think our readers will have fun looking to see what animal they are and why. And there's so many unique portrayals. So I just want you guys to dig in to have fun. Maybe like I did, bring the book on an adventure and read
Mm.
it aloud to each other. That would be really cool. But tell us where we can find this, Stephanie. This is such a beautiful, unique resource.
Yeah, it's the best place to find it is on Amazon, and so it's available in hardcover, softcover, and Kindle form on Amazon.
Oh,
Um, and I also hope kind of with those animals or any of the imagery that people can find their own words for it. That part of that succinctness can also be to like sit with it longer and find your own place with it. So for a type 4, I picked octopus without even knowing how much octopus would relate to me. And the more I've sat with octopus, I watched the documentary My
mhm.
Octopus Teacher, and I was like, oh
Yeah.
my gosh, I'm gonna have to get an octopus tattoo. I love octopuses.
Yeah.
But I didn't know that when I wrote it
Yeah.
even, and so my part of my hope is people get the book in their hands as they can sit with it and they can sort of even find their own metaphors, say like, "Gosh, I don't really love octopus. I really wish
Yeah.
she would have picked
Yeah.
egret for me." Well, go ahead, explore the egret. Talk about how that image is meaningful to you and use those metaphors as a
Mm.
way to connect with yourself, to connect with your partner,
Yeah.
um, because it just creates a different neutrality to the conversation, I think, sometimes if we're talking
Mm.
about something metaphorical versus
Mm.
targeted.
Mhm. I do
So,
too. Yeah. And
so yeah,
that analogy
Amazon is
is
the best place for the book. And then I also, my website is stephaniejspencer.com. There's some sort of, you can peek at the inside the book there if you want to do that as well.
Oh, we will. Absolutely. And I'm leaving it in the show notes. And by the way, my daughter, who is a 4, self-pres 4, loved the octopus analogy. And she was just like, oh my gosh, like we were reading how the octopus is really like, emotional and people don't always know that. And yet it has its time and retreat. And so, like, these are very nuanced analogies she gives. And I also just love how you said, like, maybe you're like, no, this is my wing, or you might notice a different animal and that might be like, oh wow, I didn't realize how much I was in my 8 right now. So
Mm.
anyway, beautiful depictions. I love that it's on Amazon. I also love your website and your Instagram. So we're leaving all that for our guests too. And thank you so much, Stephanie.
Yeah, thank you so much for having me on. I think it's a great overlap with this adventure theme that you're doing with the
Yes.
books coming out right now.
Yes. And have so much fun on your adventures.
Thank you. I will.
Hey guys, I'm so glad you could join us for another Enneagram episode. We have so much fun today talking about marriage, relationships, and all things nature today because we have a very fun guest, Stephanie Spencer. Enneagram 4 is going to come on and share with us about her new book project, Out of the Box and Into the Wild, an Enneagram study on nature and the triads. So you are going to get to feast on, if you see this on YouTube or decide to get her book, you're going to get to feast on the imagery of her beautiful travels and the extrapolation she can make from those travels to us as to metaphorical understanding of the Enneagram instead of the understanding of just like putting ourselves into that box like you're a type 1, you're a type 2, you're a perfectionist, you're a performer. She expands us a bit. She allows us to play. And I think that's what this whole month of podcasts has been about is adventuring together. And she does that through beauty. I love her fourness that she brings into this process with us to just tell us, even in the backstory, that she came to this book and all of the beautiful nature viewing that she does through wonder and through really sitting with the textures and the sensations of each place and each metaphor she chooses to use for each type. So I hope these metaphors really bless you in your relationship so that instead of just coming at your partner, you can be a bit more out of the box and say, like, ooh, I noticed we have these through lines together. Or I could be a bit like a bear at times. You could be a bit like an octopus. And we'll talk these analogies out, but she's got so many more and also very rich, earthy metaphors and metaphors from biology that we can just, instead of always using the type language, really allow ourselves to expand even in how we think of our families and ourselves. So I'm excited for this episode. And I know when I was doing family therapy work and clinical studies, a lot of times you do, even today with clients, use a family metaphor. And some people will say, oh, we're like a boat because we really float well and we have fun. And especially teen clients, they can enjoy those kinds of metaphors. Or they might be like, and here's who's at the front of that boat. Or, if we use the analogy of an animal, we can really allow ourselves to say, like, but I get very self protective when I go hibernate. So you can see that instead of just polarizing, we're bringing in a new language. And I think that is so cool because in marriage, we need creativity and healthy metaphors and language because it can get really heated, right? I just came off a traveling trip with people for like 7 or 8 days together. And you're like, oh, I need a little bit of space, or I need a little bit of a new way to talk about how I'm feeling that isn't going to hurt anybody's feelings. And so it's beautiful to have Stephanie to share with us and to guide us through ways to say, here's a strength of yours, here's a strength of mine. And let's also remember the beauty and the glory of letting stress off in marriage, in fun, in summer, in relationships when we need to most. So maybe you're not listening to this episode or watching it in the summer, but either way, make sure you're starting to also, as you listen to this convo, just join us for thoughts about getting your own travels going, even if it's very small places locally. Like I live in the Tampa, St. Pete area of Florida. Like, okay, I could go to the Florida Scrub or the ocean and enjoy a preserve and go kayaking. And these are things I can do right here. Or we could be talking about Stephanie's great trips where she's thinking about, she's, I think, headed on to Sequoia Arches. She's going to Zion. She's going to be all over doing this beautiful exploration. And then she'll go home to her northern city. So it's important that you look with us at both these wonderful epic journeys you can take, as well as just the journeys that are everyday, right? So I know I grew up in Michigan. We were always hiking and on nature walks constantly at the metro parks. And wherever you're at, just enjoy that space outdoors in the wild. Get yourself out of the box, out of the number for a little bit, and just join us on this journey with Stephanie so that we can deep dive together into what I hope is a beautiful way for you to learn.